Hi there. Today I just wanted to look at a couple of little things you can do to bring a bit of interest to your family tree. Very often, when we're researching our ancestry, what we end up with is a lot of names and dates and maybe some occupations. And when we're using the main sources for tracing ancestry back, it's usually not much more than that. But I wanted to look at a couple of things you can do to just give a bit of interest and colour to your family tree, and little snippets of insights into what their daily lives and where they lived might be like. So to this purpose, I thought I'd have a quick look at using newspapers and Google Maps to possibly find out a little bit more about your ancestors, what they did, what happened in their lives, and where they lived. And although sometimes you might find something really, really interesting, these are not necessarily really big, life-changing events, but just sometimes little everyday things that happens in the course of a life that may just end up in a newspaper. So we're going to have a look at a couple of those things. I mean, obviously, this sort of information isn't necessarily going to help you with tracing ancestry back, unless sometimes in the newspaper they might mention another family member. But this is just solely to give that little bit of extra information and to add flesh to the bones, as it were, of the people in your family history. So let's just have a look at a couple of instances I found in my own ancestry. So I'm just going to look at two branches of my family tree, branching out from my bot line. And firstly, I'm going to look at the Stamper family, who came from Yorkshire. And up here we have George Stamper, and my direct ancestor was his daughter Mary Jane Stamper, who was my great-grandmother, the mother of my paternal grandmother. And George Stamper, therefore, of course, was my great-great-grandfather. We see here he was a butcher, and he was born in Malton in Yorkshire, and they are living in New Malton in the parish of St Leonard's. And the address on here is Old Malton Gate. Now, I always find it interesting to look at the addresses on census records, because we can have a look now. As long as those places, or the streets or the buildings that were there are still around, we might be able to see the house, if we're lucky, or just the type of house that they were living in, or the type of street. So I always recommend having Google Maps open on a browser. So I'm going to look at, it was Old Malton Gate, and it was spelt in the census as all two words, but it's actually, when you look on Google Maps, it's now spelt Old and then Malton and Gate, all one word. So we can see where it is on the map first of all. Pull out a bit. So this is Old Malton Gate along here. So we can get an idea of where it is in Malton. And interestingly, the parish of Norton is there too, or it used to be called Norton by Malton, and some of my ancestors lived there as well. If we zoom in again and look at Old Malton Gate, we can see it here. It was written just there on the map. And what we can do, of course, is we can drag in our little man and have a look at that street. And of course, it's obviously now the B1257. we want to come a bit more into the village. Interestingly, I found, let's get rid of this. You've got those rather nice houses along there, and then you've got this big old gate, which is, I think, belongs to the lorry getting in the way. Rather interesting historical building there. That, I believe, it's now a hotel, but I believe it's called Moulton Lodge. It's a big old Tudor house, possibly Old Moulton Gate. I don't know whether it's named after these kind of big gates here, but anyway, you can have a look. Here we are down here. This is probably the kind of place. My grandfather, George Stamper, at the time of the census, was a butcher. He also had been a shoemaker and cordwainer, though, as quite often in Victorian times, people had various trades, sometimes all at the same time. And you can see it's there. It's called Old Moulton Gate. So these are probably the types of places, although unfortunately on the census we don't have an actual number. But even when you do have a number, you have to be very careful, because especially where maybe a street has been extended and new houses built at various points, sometimes the numbers change. So if you do have the number of a house on the census, you might be able to find that number on Street View, but you might have to do some digging around to see if you can find whether the street numbers change, to be absolutely sure you've got the right house. But anyway, this is rather interesting, as we can see down here, the kind of places, the kind of houses that there's St Leonard's Church, where they also, that's always useful and nice to look at. We can find photos of churches where all the children were baptised and where they were married. So it would have been probably just round the corner from his house, and he probably lived above where he had his trade. So Old Moulton Gate goes all the way down here, so it could be any of these. We just don't know, but it's nice to have a look at these types of houses where they would have lived. Now, another thing that is very useful, just to see if you can find some little snippets about your ancestors, or give you some insight into their lives, is to look at newspapers. And Find My Past has a very good selection of newspapers. There's also British newspapers online. I like to use Find My Past newspapers because it's just handy when I'm using that. But if I'm really wanting to do a big search of newspapers, I'll try British newspapers online as well. So the way you search for that, we've clicked on newspapers, and we're going to look again for George Stamper, my great-great-grandfather. And in here, in this initial search bit, we can put a keyword. Usually a place name is probably a good idea if we don't have anything else. So we're going to put in Moulton. And just to click on search, and then here we can refine it down a bit. So if we look at George Stamper's dates, here he is. He lived from 1813 to 1877. So if we look at dates published, it's brought up all the dates that cover instances of the name George Stamper. So we could use both of those. We could also look at county of publication, place of publication, but let's just have a look and see what there is here. So here we've got something that seems to relate to my ancestor, because it's butchers, and it's Moulton, and it's George Stamper. So knowing that he was a butcher, knowing that he lived in Moulton, this looks very like it. These things, these are just quotes from the newspaper. You have to be quite careful. They're not always easy to check whether it's your person or not. You can see down here we've got a George Stamper, a shipwright, so we know that's not him. We can have a look at this. Now, when you get onto the page, you'll find that some of your the words you used in your search are highlighted, and luckily we see George Stamper here right at the top. It seems to be that George Stamper was a defendant. So that's interesting. I mean, you would have to look more fully at the whole of that article. It seems to be that this, if we come out here, this is under local news, and it's from the Moulton County Court. So it looks to me like my ancestor got into a bit of trouble here. There's something to do with the price of meat. But that is very interesting little snippet. But let's go back again. And we also have, that says marriages there, but if we look at where it says George Stamper, we can see that this is actually a death record here. So this is under the whole of the births, marriages and deaths section. Let's zoom in here and we can see, there we go. Zoom in a bit more. New Moulton, September the 11th, of measles, aged 17 months, Maria, daughter of George Stamper, butcher. A rather sad little thing. And we can see here in the under my Family Tree Maker page, we can see two Maria Stampers. There is this one, she was born in 1853, and I have her death there. They had another daughter who sadly also died very young. So we can see here little snippets into the lives of these people, for whom very often, especially when it's before the census, we often know very little beyond names and dates. And of course, if you want to download, you can do that. If you can download here on this little arrow. So if we just go to the downloads here and open this up, we don't want the whole page. So we can, if we click on edit, and then we can just crop it, bring it down here somewhere, and yeah, there it is. Crop it right down, and then we can just save a copy. I've cropped that off a bit, but you could always edit that again. But just to show you how you can do this, and I have a file here for the Stamper family, and I should just save it to that. And of course, it's historically interesting too, because she died of measles, which nowadays is not usually a life-threatening disease for children, but of course in the mid-19th century it really was. These little bits of information are just interesting. They don't help us with tracing the family, but they're little insights into their lives and what happened to them. So I always think it's really worthwhile checking out newspapers, and just for these little tiny snippets of information that just brings these names and dates we have to life and gives them colour and interest. And I just want to illustrate another type of newspaper item you might find, and also how you can use it. So I'm just going to go over to this branch of my family, the Whitings. And Sarah Whiting's father was Thomas Whiting, born in Scarborough in Yorkshire in 1787. And all I knew about Thomas Whiting beforehand was that he was a printer, and that was just the occupation that was given on his daughter's marriage record. The printer, could mean various things. We don't know from that whether he worked on his own account or whether he was an employee, or what type of printing it was. So I looked at the newspapers for Yorkshire on Find My Past, and I searched for Thomas Whiting, and I found this. It's from the Hull Advertiser, 1821, and it's a shop to be let to booksellers and printers. An old established shop in the book, stationery, paper hanging and printing business, with a good dwelling house and convenient offices attached, situated in the best part of Newbury Street in Scarborough, etc. And if we look further down, the person on the premises is Mr. Thomas Whiting. So further down, also further particulars may be had on application to Mr. Richard Whiting or Mr. Matthew Cowling. Now, Thomas's father was Richard, so that may well be his father as well. Fairly old by then, perhaps, but that is certainly around about the right date for both of these people. So that was really interesting because it showed me much more about Thomas's business and occupation. Not only was he in the printing business, but he does seem to have had a shop selling books as well, which is very interesting for me, as I am also a writer, and it's always lovely to find people in your family tree connected to the same thing that is of interest to you. And I also have another YouTube channel all about books. So it's really great to find something like this. Something that your ancestor did that is of interest to you in your life. But another further thing we can do from this, we've got Newbury Street in Scarborough. So we can have a look at that. And I wonder what the best part of Newbury Street was. So let's see, look and see if we can find anything here. Newbury, Scarborough. Now Newbury Street is there's no longer, I found when I looked this up, it's no longer called Newbury Street. It just seems to be an area called Newbury, and it seems to be along this street here, which is just called Newbury. So this must be the street. And if we drag our little man in, we can see this is very much a very busy area in the centre of Scarborough. So probably the best part of Newbury Street was probably this kind of central area, or maybe up towards that crossing there. We can imagine my ancestor having his printing and book-selling business somewhere along here, maybe up in that now pedestrianised part. We need to find out more about the history of this area, but it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you look at these old buildings up there, you can imagine maybe something like that, because the newspaper article also says that there is a house above the business, so he probably lived there and worked there. those are some of the really interesting things you can find, and particularly if you're thinking of visiting the places where your ancestors lived and worked. And by the way, if you wanted to take a picture from Google, the Street View, you can do that. If you use the print screen key on your keyboard, which is, if you don't already know, is usually over to the right at the top, and on my keyboard it's PRT SC. And if we click on that, it will show you the screenshot of the picture you've copied. You can either open that and edit it and save it, or you could open up Word and paste it onto a Word document. Do remember, when you're copying and pasting any document, either from Street View or any documents that I've shown you before, do remember that they are copyright protected. So fine for your own use, personal use. But if you're publishing publicly anything, then you do have to get permission to use any of these things. Okay. So there we are. In these particular examples, I've looked at the birth, marriage and death notices, and I've looked at an advertising newspaper where one of my ancestors was letting out a shop. You never quite know what you might find in newspapers when you start searching for an ancestor. There are all sorts of things that could turn up. Sometimes you might, if somebody was of good social standing in his community, you might find an obituary, which can be really useful, because often obituaries gives you a kind of potted history of their life. You might find an incident that's happened that's reported in the newspaper, police reports, inquests sometimes if a death has been a bit unusual, all kinds of incidents. You never quite know what you might find. Your ancestor might have been a witness to a crime, or they might be involved in a crime, either as the perpetrator or the victim. And these can really, really add interest to your family history. And also, I really love using maps, and sometimes we can find streets, or sometimes even specific buildings, where your ancestors lived. And we can also look very often now at the churches, because mostly these churches are still there, where your ancestors were married, baptized, buried, etc. And also an idea of the type of place they lived in, what they might have been in the community, how they might have lived. So even these tiny little snippets, these little newspaper snippets I found and looking at the maps, gives me an idea of two of the people in my family history. Maybe one day on a holiday I might visit Scarborough and walk down that street where my ancestor once lived and worked. So there you go, the little bits of extra you can add to your family history information, just to add to those names and dates. And if you want to see another area where you can use maps, you might like to look at my video on researching baptisms in the 18th century. So don't forget to subscribe for more tips and ways of researching and finding information on your ancestors, and more videos where you can watch me carry out research and sometimes solve those brick walls. So see you soon. Bye for now.